This conference will now be recorded.
Hello, everybody. Jordan Girth here from the National Weather Service Office of Observations. Thank you so much for joining us for the Satellite Book Club Seminar Series. This is session number 163. The title of today's presentation is On-Site Decision Support During the 2023 Sioux Falls Airshow, Best Practices and Lessons Learned. We're glad to have the presenter, Peter Rogers, the Warning Coordination Meteorologist from the NWS WFO in Sioux Falls, South Dakota. I'm also glad to have the discussion following Peter's presentation from Scott Lindstrom, scientist and trainer at the Cooperative Institute for Meteorological Satellite Studies, SIMS, the birthplace of satellite meteorology in Madison, Wisconsin. I'd like to remind the audience, as you just heard, that this session is being recorded and there will be opportunity for Q&A after the presentation as normal. I would encourage attendees to post their questions in the chat and we will field them there. If you want to ask your question out loud, of course you can do so. But for everyone, please sign in or specify your full name when asking a question in the chat so we can follow up if necessary. We're always looking for future presenters, particularly if you recently presented at the National Weather Association annual meeting. Get in touch with Kashad Bowman and Emily Maddox if you'd like to become part of this seminar series. And the training team can help create training materials that may be unavailable. Ross Van Til, the Office of the Chief Learning Officer, can help you with that. I'd like to thank our Tower S team, Kashad and Emily, the Office of the Chief Learning Officer, GOES-R JPSS program, our presenter, facilitator, and all of you for being with us today. Without further ado, Peter Rogers is the Warning Coordination Meteorologist at the NWS in Sioux Falls, serving as the primary liaison between the Weather Service and local partners and the public, including emergency managers, media, law enforcement, fire departments, schools, and other state and local government agencies. He's responsible for the proper reception and dissemination of warning information, building relationships with partners, and educating the public. Peter, welcome to the book club.
Thank you much, Jordan. I appreciate the opportunity to speak with everybody this morning or this afternoon, depending on where you're joining us from. Again, my name is Peter Rogers. I'm the Warning Coordination Meteorologist here in Sioux Falls, and I appreciate the chance to get to talk to you about our decision support that we provided during the Sioux Falls Airshow this past summer. So just briefly, a little overview here about what the Airshow was. It was back on July 29th and 30th of this summer. It was at the Sioux Falls Regional Airport, KFSD, and one of the unique things about this air show is that we were able to partner with the South Dakota Air National Guard. There's the 114th Fighter Wing Station here at the Sioux Falls Airport, and we partnered with them, who are the primary hosts of the air show themselves, along with the civilian organizers that help put this event on. It is a free air show, which is a little unique. I don't think that happens too often across the country anymore, but it's a free air show, and it highlighted multiple regional and national performers. And the big draw this year was we had the U.S. Air Force Thunderbirds in attendance. So I wanted to provide a little logistical information here for those who may not be familiar with the area. So I've got a satellite image here showing the airfield itself. The red box there is highlighting the portion where most of the spectators were during the event. The airbase itself is just to the south there of that red box, but shelter was very limited on the base, certainly not enough to potentially house all of the people that would be attending this event. And so the primary incident action plan that we helped put together in the meetings leading up to the event called for evacuating attendees to their vehicles if time allowed. And we'll talk more about that later. So most of the attendees parked in either there's an industrial park just to the south of the base, and a lot of them parked there and then just walked onto the base. But then they also had 3 park and ride areas across the city, which they bus people in and out of the event as well. So when we're talking about hazardous weather in particular for this event, it wasn't necessarily like a radius, like storms within this particular radius before action was taken. It was more based on time. And because of the number of people expected, the time estimated to evacuate it was 2 or more hours. And I will say this was an estimate, because as far back as this particular event has been ongoing, this was the first time where an evacuation actually occurred. Every time that this event has occurred prior to this, they were able to get through without any issues. So that 2+ hour time frame was somewhat of an estimate, but something that we worked with very closely with our partners to define. So talking about the attendance itself, this two-day event in years past drew around 100,000 total folks over that two-day period. But this was the first air show here in Sioux Falls since 2019 and the pandemic. And that first day, the 29th, Saturday, was a blue sky day. Probably perfect conditions for an air show. Couldn't ask for any better. A little warm, but other than that, it was pretty nice. And so very large crowds came out for that day. We had, just on that first day, an estimated 75,000 people. And you can see there by that picture on the top, again, kind of what I was talking about by overall lack of shelter and just people being out there in the open. Most folks were just coming in with their lawn chairs and parking it somewhere in the grassy area, and that's where they would sit to watch the show. Because it was sunny, some people would take shelter there under the planes, so it's a little bit of shade as well. So our office is actually very near the airport. We're on the east side of the airport, but because of the size and scope of this event, we thought it was important and necessary for us to have an on-site presence as well. Being a more rural forecast office, we don't have a lot of opportunities for on-site support, and this was certainly one of our bigger events for the summer. So myself, as well as our MIC, Todd Heidkamp, were on site for this particular event, and we were housed here, and they had a mobile emergency operations center trailer there that we sat in as well. But then we were also working very closely with our other staff that were here at the WFO as well, and we'll talk more about how that interaction occurred throughout the event. All right, so let's get into the weather here a little bit. When we briefed the decision makers on Saturday at the end of that first day, the forecast at that time basically called for another blue sky day on Sunday. We weren't really expecting much overall impact, but when Todd and I arrived Sunday morning there at about 7:30, we pulled up the radar right away, and this is what we had. There were showers and storms that had developed in the early morning hours across North Dakota, and they were dropping to the east-southeast with time. This radar loop goes from roughly 5:30 that morning until 8 o'clock. And so this was immediate cause for concern. And so we had an 8 a.m. pilot briefing, and we went in there right away and saying, hey, watching radar here, there are some storms upstream, and they're moving in this general direction. So it's definitely something we're going to want to watch over the next few hours. So what was actually the cause of this? So for us here in the Northern Plains, and this is pretty common in July, pretty strong ridge over the Intermountain West, Northern Rockies area, and we were in northwest flow across the Dakotas these 2 days. And a little ridge rider came over the top there, and you can see from the water vapor loop here from 4 to 8 a.m. that morning, little short wave there on the top of that ridge that was helping to initiate those thunderstorms across the Dakotas and then to gradually, shift to the east-southeast with time. So looking at the synoptic setup a little bit for the day, now this is just a certain time shot here off of some of SPC's graphics. This was at 8 a.m. or 13Z that morning. 500 heights on the left, 300 on the right, with winds as well. And you can see that northwest flow. And generally speaking, I forgot to mention this earlier, if you're not familiar with where Sioux Falls is, highlighted there with the yellow star there, we are pretty much right at the intersection there, very close to where South Dakota, Minnesota, and Iowa come together in the southeast corner of the state. But northwest flow, right entrance region of an upper level jet streak that helped to support these storms. And so that's kind of the overall flow pattern that we are in for these couple days. If you go down a little bit to the 925 and 850 levels on these images, we're showing heights, temperatures, dew point, and wind. You can see there's a pretty tight moisture gradient in the green contours there from northwest to southeast at both levels, a little bit farther to the east at 850 compared to 925. But then you also had some pretty decent warm air advection, especially at the 850 level there with the southwesterly winds coming into that moisture gradient. And that setup was definitely there to help support that thunderstorm development and evolution. Looking a little bit more at some of the instability parameters here. On the far left, I have ML Cape and SIN. The middle panel, most unstable Cape and lifted parcel. And then on the far right, we have surface to 6 kilometer shear. And the instability, at least at the low levels, really wasn't great. You had to go more into the central western portions of the state. But when you look at the most unstable in the center panel, that instability axis is a little bit farther to the east there, maybe 500 to 1,000 joules, a little closer to the east central portion of the state, but still not a lot of instability to work with. But shear was not a problem. With that wave coming through, we had that 50 to 60 knots, 0 to 6 kilometer shear. So that was certainly there to help support with what little instability was to work with. So then we pull out some of our favorite short-term resolution models here. And looking here at the HER in particular, this is the 10Z run from 5 a.m. that morning. And on the left side, I have reflectivity. On the right, I have wind. And so that 10Z run was shown. It was picking up on some of the activity, but it wasn't really doing much with it as it moved to the southeast. So it was kind of fizzling out, weakening as it approached Sioux Falls. And so when you compare that against the overall wind field, again, not much of a surprise. There really wasn't much of a wind signature with those storms as they came through, at least within what the HER was showing. However, you move 1 hour farther. So now we're looking at the 11Z output, same panels here. In this case, pretty different story. We had the storms being picked up better within the model and coming across the Sioux Falls area, and pretty robustly as well. And when you look at the corresponding wind plot here on the right-hand side, you can see that there was actually a pretty decent wind signature coming with that as well. So now we're concerned about not just potential lightning issues, but is there going to be some wind that could also have problems? And so we were definitely watching both of these and paying close attention as we were going through the rest of that morning. Well, you may see where this is going. When we looked at subsequent runs of the HER, both at 12Z and 13Z, which are the left-hand panels and the right-hand panels on this image, showing both the reflectivity and the wind, they flip-flopped. So the 12Z run went back to the 10Z, showing basically nothing. And these are all valid at 3 o'clock, I should say. And then the 13Z run flip-flopped back to what the 11Z run was, which was showing something coming through Sioux Falls with, again, another wind signature. So needless to say, over 4 different runs that morning, we weren't very confident in what was going to happen with these storms. And so then you really have to go back to, okay, what are the observational trends showing? And what is the environment conducive for the evolution of these storms? And so those are the things we really had to start looking into. I should also say the other 12Z models that came in shortly thereafter, especially the high resolution runs, weren't providing a lot of additional assistance either in that way. And so that's why we had to start looking at other things. So let's look at the radar loop here a little bit later. This is from 8 to 10 o'clock that morning. After we initially gave that pilot briefing to say storms are up there, they're moving in this general direction, we have to pay attention, and they continue to do so. The strongest storms are anchored on the southwestern flank of the overall MCS as it's moving through, and some of those storms are pretty strong. They're being warned on for some hail and wind, a little bit of flash flooding actually up there in North Dakota. And so at this time, our level of concern is increasing even more. And so we get a hold of the Air National Guard colonel, who was the primary point of contact and the primary decision maker for this event. We said, okay, probabilities are increasing that we're going to have some impacts at the airfield from these thunderstorms by early afternoon. Okay, so I know this is a satellite book club, so we want to include some satellite information here as well, and I'll have some towards the end of the presentation as well. But what was the infrared showing here at this time? And not surprisingly, we had the coldest cloud tops there, coincident with the strongest thunderstorms on the southwest flank as it came through. But if you look as this loop goes through, it looks like there's a little bit of a warming, a little bit of a weakening, especially on the eastern edge of these storms and as they continue to move to the south. And so not only was there a concern of like where the storms were going to eventually go, but were they going to hold together long enough to impact the airfield? So the colonel then called. We were supposed to have a 12 p.m. briefing, but because of the threat, incoming threat, he moved that up to 11 o'clock. So we had a weather briefing at 11 a.m. And at that time, we felt pretty confident that the strongest storms were going to remain to the west of the airfield, that they were going to remain anchored closer to where that low to mid-level instability axis was. Having said that, you can see there on the image that Todd's pointing to there, who's our meteorologist in charge, that there was scattered lightning still within that rain shield to the east of the strongest thunderstorms. And so again, going back to the idea of how much time do we have to make a decision here, roughly when these storms are going to approach the Huron, South Dakota area, which is to the northwest of Sioux Falls, we were within that 2-hour time window. And that's actually really close to where Todd's pointing at in this particular photo as well. And so I don't know if any of you have ever worked with the military in particular, but their decision-making process is very different from my experience in working with the civilian world. And so they're very black and white, cut and dry. They want to know exactly what's going to happen and when it's going to happen. And as we know, we work in a probability world with uncertainty. And so that can be a little bit unnerving. But at this time, the colonel did direct the staff to begin preparations for evacuation. It wasn't, we are doing it, but we're going to at least start to prepare for it. And one of the biggest decisions he made that was really helpful in hindsight was that they stopped busing people in from the 3 park and ride stations across the city at that time, saying, okay, if we do have to evacuate, we don't want to bring in more people on. We want to deal with who we have now. And so they made that decision at 11 o'clock. Move forward 1 more hour, so we continue to monitor trends over that next hour, and then at 12 o'clock, the colonel calls us in again for another briefing, wants to know what's going on. And yes, the trends are still showing that we are going to have the strongest storms just off to the west, but that rain shield is still supporting lightning activity and is likely to move in. And so the decision was made by the colonel to cancel the air show and activated the incident action plan to evacuate. This picture here is the evacuation. It was very orderly. It was very smooth. People just calmly walked to the edge of the airfield, got on the buses and stopped and started going back. I think, because it was still early, the buses stopped an hour earlier than that. There were only about 20,000 people on base at the time of the evacuation decision. So instead of having to move 75,000 folks from the day before, it was much smaller fraction of that. And so I think that also helped quite a bit in the overall process. All right, so what actually happened here? Zooming in here a little bit more, looking at the local radar. Thankfully, I've never been more excited to actually see a thunderstorm at the airport than I was that day, because it was a little nerve-wracking when you make that final decision and they shut everything down when the storms are still moving towards the area and weakening at the same time. But we did have moderate rain and thunderstorms that did impact the airfield between roughly 1:15 and 2:30. But unfortunately, because the FAA requires a waiver for these air shows and it expired at 4 o'clock, there was no way to get folks back on base in order to have the rest of the performers do. So they had about an hour of the performance between 11 and noon, and then after that, the rest of it was canceled, including the Thunderbirds that afternoon. So that was unfortunate, but we did get people to safety in plenty of time. If you want to dig really deep into the details here, the METARs from that afternoon, from roughly 1 to 4 o'clock that afternoon, rain began at 1:15, ended at 2:28, and then the thunderstorm was roughly from 1:42 to 2:03, about 20 minutes. So not a lot. But the threat was still there, and because of the sheltering plan at the time, we needed to get people off into safety. So most attendees were off base by the time it started raining, and then everybody was off base by the time the thunderstorm began. All right, again, because this is a satellite book club, I did want to hit on a couple more things here that some of you have maybe used in the past. I will admit, on site when I was in the trailer, these 2 products that I'm showing here, I was not actively watching, but I know that our staff in the forecast office was, and that's why it's super critical in these on-site support situations to not only be discussing issues with the decision makers that are in the room with you, but you're also actively communicating back with the weather forecast office staff to make sure that you're on the same page, you're seeing the same things, you're looking at timing information, overall threats, and so on. And so in this particular instance, I got a loop here for the GOES lightning mapper. And I think, if I would have seen this in real time, if I had been watching it, this might have helped increase my confidence a little bit in that lightning occurrence over the area, because you can see where the clustering is certainly where the strongest storms are, but there's still quite a bit of lightning in the rain shield to the east within that overall complex. One thing I will say is that in my experience, on-site visualization tools are normally browser or online based, and they're becoming better and better with time, but they still might not be quite as robust as what's available at the WFO setting. So again, that's why it's super critical to be in constant communication with the folks back in the office as well. All right, the other thing too I wanted to touch on quickly is the GOES Prob Severe Lightning Cast. Now, at least for our office, this is relatively new, and I think the overall product is still relatively new as well. But we've been using this more and more over the summer for on-site support and remote support, which is the vast majority of what we do here in our more rural office. But if you're unfamiliar with this product, it's using satellite information to calculate the probability of lightning at any one location within an hour. Now, you can't use this as a standalone product, but with other data sets, it can help provide critical timing and probabilistic information to decision makers. And so in this case, you can see in this animation, the purple contour is there at a 75% chance and the green is 50. So again, higher probabilities to the south and west, but not non-zero over the Sioux Falls area. You can also look at this in a time series sense. So this is for the Sioux Falls Airport, showing the probabilities, the 1 minute in yellow, the 5 minute in red, and then the GOES GLM flash counts there with the little blue dots. For Sioux Falls that afternoon, it increased at about 1240, peaking around 70 to 80% between 1:30 and 1:50. which matches pretty well with what the METAR ended up showing later that day. This is unique though, because remember, we had a 2-hour time window that we were working with. And if you look at this time graph here, 12 o'clock is right here. So by this point here, we've already made the decision to shut things down. And we're still showing 0% probability. So if you're going to use this, especially if your time range is less or more than an hour, excuse me, because this product is really only meant for within an hour, you need to be monitoring upstream conditions as well. So in this case, you could have looked at Huron or Mobridge, South Dakota to see how this plot was changing with time, and then try to extrapolate that to the southeast as the storms push through the area. So very useful tool, something I think we're going to use a lot more in the future, but that is something that we did see that day. Okay, real quickly here, a lot of words, but I did want to try to hit on some best practices and lessons learned from this event. Fostering relationships with key decision makers well before the event is critical. Todd and I attended like 4 or 5 different meetings before this event even happened, and this helps build trust and to ensure clear and consistent communication between everybody that's involved. You cannot just show up on the day of and expect things to go well. Identify the person or persons who are going to be responsible for making that evacuation decision. In this case, because the Air Guard was hosting the event, the colonel was ultimately the one who made that decision, but we had a meeting to decide that. We sat down and said, okay, who is going to be the one responsible for doing this, saying yes or no, go or no go. On-site decision support requires additional collaboration with the forecast office. I talked about how important that was for us. And so if possible, it's best that in an on-site situation to have 2 people. For our event, I was primarily responsible for communicating with the forecast office. Todd was communicating that information from me out to the decision makers. It would have been really tough, I think, for one person to handle all of that at one time, especially within that 2-hour critical window as the storms were approaching the area. The collaboration that we used with the forecast office was done through Google Chat and occasional phone calls, and that actually worked really well. Especially chat allowed us to share some images back and forth with each other to show what we were looking at. And also, I think anybody who's done on-site support, this is critical. Make sure that there's a dedicated internet connection. Don't rely solely on cell towers or hotspots. Thankfully, for this event, the Air Guard did provide us with a dedicated internet line, and that allowed us the ability to not have to fight against other cell traffic. Although even that did slow down a little bit as we went later into the day, especially on that Sunday afternoon. I already mentioned this earlier. Online and browser-based data visualization tools are becoming more frequent and better, and I really appreciate those. But again, they're probably still not as robust as what you have at the WFO level, especially within AWIPS, and so the WFO can help fill those voids as needed. Be flexible and nimble, right? This is a big topic in a lot of different areas within the Weather Service right now, but plans may change with a little advance notice. We were initially set up in that mobile emergency operations center, but the briefings that we did were actually in a nearby building in an auditorium type setting. And so you had to grab all of your equipment, walk over to the area, make sure you got there in time to set everything up. Had to bring a mobile internet puck with you because it wasn't the same as what was in the trailer. So you have to be willing to ride with the punches and do things when they're required. And then this very last point, I do want to make this kind of an important issue here, is that our support was successful for this event for a number of different reasons that I went through, but we also had an ideal situation where the thunderstorms formed well upstream of the airport. We had a lot of time to analyze data, to provide information to the decision makers, to ultimately be successful in getting people off before it hit the airfield. But what would happen if instead of 20,000 people, we had 75,000? What if instead of the storms forming in North Dakota, they formed within a 30-mile donut of the airfield? What are you going to do? And in those cases, you're not going to have the time to fully evacuate everybody off. So you're going to have to start putting people places. And so we did have some of those conversations in the plans leading up to this event. But I think in most of our situations, whether it would be the air show or other events that we're supporting remotely or in person, this is a bigger issue. I don't think a lot of places fully think through what they need to do if they have much less time than they would require to actually get people to safety. So with that, I appreciate the time. My contact information is there. I do want to especially thank my friends there at Sierra and Fort Collins and Sims and Madison. They helped with some of the archival of the satellite data for me for this presentation. And there's a picture there of one of the weather briefings there and all the decision makers at the time. But I would be happy to answer any questions people might have, and but that's all I have for the formal slide set. Thank you.
Thanks, Peter. This is Scott at Sims. For all our people listening, please stay on for the discussion. Make sure if you're asking a question, that you identify who you are with your full name, put your full name in the chat when you're asking a question, and there'll be a feedback survey that you can please fill out that will also be posted in the chat room. Keep an eye out also, let's see, in a week, next Thursday, October 12th at 12 p.m., Jordan Rabinowitz from Eastern Region Headquarters will discuss the National Weather Service Satellite Product Training Guide that he's been creating. Contact Kashad Bowman or Emily Maddox for questions about the Satellite Book Club or for configuration of any satellite products you have. And I'm going to start off the questions here. This is something I kind of wonder about, because when you have this big air show, of course, me in Wisconsin, I'm thinking of EAA in Oshkosh, which National Weather Service in Green Bay is going to do decision support. So when you're contacted for something like this, do you spin up stuff from scratch, or is there some kind of repository sitting in regional somewhere where you can go and say, okay, for past events like this that have been done, they've done this, this, and this, or are you doing this all kind of in an ad hoc manner?
No, that's a good question. I do think it is somewhat WFO specific in terms of the exact details and the exact needs of the partner for a specific group. Before coming to Sioux Falls, I was a forecaster in La Crosse, Wisconsin. I actually had an opportunity to provide on-site support for the Oshkosh event in 2018. But I think at that time, the whole idea of like on-site support was just starting to kind of bubble up, and we're looking at how to do that. So I know at least here locally in Sioux Falls, we are trying to do better with having a set of tools available for the on-site forecaster to make sure that they have everything that they need on site to be able to prepare for that event, whether it be through an informal verbal briefing or a more formal briefing that would require graphics or some kind of a slide set. I do know that, you know, in recent years, we have tried to do some in-house training with our staff and working with a couple of our partners on what we would do in on-site situations. I will say for our office, again, being more rural, our opportunities for on-site are probably less than a major metropolitan area, but it's something we're constantly thinking about to figure out how do we exactly want to do this. At least within Central Region, there is a formal request process for this on-site support through a Google form. And so that process is pretty standard across the Central Region offices. But in terms of how it's actually done, I think there's a little wiggle room from office to office, although I know that we've also been talking recently about implementing more event-ready type concepts that have been shared with from the Chicago office, especially for some of these larger events that have, you know, tens of thousands of people and are outdoors.
Thanks. So what's the population of Sioux Falls that you were able to get 75,000 people there? That seems like most of the city to me.
Yeah, so a little more context about South Dakota. So South Dakota as a state has less than 1 million people, but Sioux Falls is the largest city, and we have, if you're looking at kind of the broader metro area, it's in that 200 to 250,000 range. But we are a regional hub, and because it is because it was a free event as well, we pull in from a lot of the surrounding communities for some of these larger events. So actually 75,000 was pretty dang good.
Yeah. And it looked like a great forecast. What was the end reaction from the colonel? Did he give you good thanks? Did you get good thanks from him?
Yeah, you know, there were a lot of nervous people in that 1.5 to 2 hour window between when the decision was made to start moving people and when the storm actually came through. The colonel and the air guard in particular was extremely grateful, very appreciative of our services. And again, I think a lot of that also just goes back to building those relationships. If we hadn't attended all those meetings leading up to it, people wouldn't know who we are. That trust might not have been at the level that it should have been in order to have a successful time frame. So, I mean, unfortunately, I mean, nobody wants to shut this down, right? Because we understand that there's a lot of potentially conflicting things that are going on with an event of this size. But public safety is always our #1 priority. And I think people were overall very appreciative of what happened. And even talking with the folks as they're evacuating, it's like, yeah, this is a big bummer, but we get it. And so people were you know, not necessarily upset, they were disappointed, but they understood and they moved off without incident.
Okay, I have some comments from people. Sheldon Cusselson has put into the chat an animation toward the end of this event that shows the advected layer precipitable water loop. So you can see the confirmation of increasing surface to 850 millibar precipitable water to help sustain the convection that's drifting to the southeast. So I refer people to the chat there for those, for that animation and some imagery. Andy Lomax comments, Andy Lomax is retired military, so it sounded very familiar. This was a phenomenal briefing, and the event was an outstanding job in providing important information to decision makers for protecting life and property. So maybe he's not the colonel, but he's certainly giving you kudos for what you did at this particular event. Jarell Torres from Sierra asks, when you're deployed to air shows and other public events, which online websites are you using to access the satellite data?
That's a good question. So there is, I don't know with the audience here, how many of you are familiar with Thin Client? It's a PC-based version of AWIPS, and I did not use that for this event. In my experience, it hasn't been very reliable, or it's been very slow, and some of that has to do with connectivity. But all that to say is that at least for this event, that wasn't available to us. We didn't use it. You know, there's not. I'm learning actually in the presentation, putting this together. I came across some online resources from satellite that I didn't realize existed ahead of time. Some of the stuff put on by SIMS, for example, their probability of lightning detection with the lightning cast. For this particular event, I was using College of DuPage satellite because it's a very easy interface. It has everything on there that you'd need, minus the lightning. That's what I had up for this particular event. I'm sure there's much better things out there, and if people have suggestions, I'm all ears. But that's what I was using that day.
Thanks. Dan Riley asks, was the jurisdiction responsible for the safety aspect of the event, or was that privately contracted out?
So because the Air Guard was the host of the event, they were and it was their property essentially. They were the ones responsible for the public safety aspect. Although, as you can see from I don't know if it's still up on the screen here, but from the briefing room, the individuals there in blue shirts, they were the civilian event organizers. And then you can see a lot of military uniforms in there as well. But then we had representatives from the city and the county, and we were all working together, and everybody knew each other very well. But yeah, the public safety component was ultimately the responsibility of the Air Guard, and they were the ones that did make that final decision based on the information we provided. And then everybody basically went with it. I mean, you can see the colonel standing up there in front. He was like, all right, incident action plan, let's go. And everybody basically just got up and went and did their jobs, which was refreshing, quite honestly, because sometimes it can be a lot more chaotic than that. And so it was a good learning experience for me, for sure.
Jordan Girth asks, did Air Force meteorologists provide any support for this event or to the pilots? Was there any risk of two sources of information?
Yeah, that's a good question. And, you know, there was so because they have the 114th Fighter Wing there is an operations part of the base there where they've got a room filled with screens and they're getting information. I'm not exactly sure from which Air Force base in the country. But they were watching things as well and still getting information. Our component of it, though, was strictly for public safety and the attendees that were in attendance. Now, we, as part of the pilot briefing and the other briefings, some of the pilots for the acts were in attendance and would be able to hear that, but we weren't directly providing aviation weather support, if that makes sense, when it comes to the actual flights. And so, but the Thunderbirds were part of those discussions as well. And so that's a good question. I should probably follow up on that, but I'm not entirely sure where some of that might have been coming from.
Okay, Joe Moore from Duluth asks, or first he comments, great presentation. It sounds like your Airbus, Airshow company, and EM worked well together. Can you expand on that in the planning process? And then he comments, I have found we always are coordinating with the air boss at the last minute, and EM is more outside and does not have control for evac decisions.
Good question, Joe. So similar to you, I mean, we didn't meet the air boss in person until the morning of the first day of the air show. So that air boss was not a part, at least not that I can recall of, in a more formalized sense, a part of the meetings leading up to that. But when the decision was made early on, at least from an evacuation standpoint, that this is a decision that holds with the Air Guard and the colonel in particular, then, I mean, once that question was answered, the rest of it just kind of fell out from there. And so, I mean, I guess every air boss is different, but we ended up having a good working relationship with the air boss because the first day, Saturday, was a blue sky day. We were able to use that as an opportunity to further introduce ourselves to other people that we might not have met in the meetings leading up to it, and that certainly helped as well. So yeah, it wasn't an issue for us, but I can certainly see how that might be a problem in some situations, and that might be more of a personality issue. Or a misunderstanding of roles when it comes to the different people involved.
Yeah, it kind of makes you wonder how this had played out if the days had flipped and your blue sky day was the last day.
So, I didn't think about that, but yeah, it could have been different.
Ida Hakarinen asks, he presumes that there is a National Weather Service policy regarding on-site support to events, wondering about the role of private meteorological services in providing such support, particularly in the area of specialized forecasts.
Yeah, great question. So the National Weather Service, when they provide the support, it is government to government. Again, this is pretty easy for us, being that the Air Guard is with the Air Force, which is federal government. It was government to government. If there are other private interests involved in those meetings, so be it, but they are there. If there's an event, let's not say the air show, but if there's another event in our service area, in our CWA, that we know that there is a private weather entity involved, then we back away. Unless the emergency manager, as another government entity, specifically requests support, and we will provide that support for the purposes of public safety to that government partner. But if there's a private interest in there, we tend to step back a little bit, or at least take some time to better define who's doing what, because we do not want to step on the toes of the private interests that can provide similar services for events.
Okay, thanks. A couple more comments. Tim Schmidt has posted some GOES imagery, a link for GOES imagery and product pages, so you can look at those at your leisure. Don't forget that there is a feedback survey for this that Emily Maddox has posted. And David Donahue mentioned that College of DuPage does have lightning at their website, has real-time lightning. Here's a late breaking comment. What can the National Weather Service do to better interface with the air boss and organizers to provide their services to make each of these types of events a normal routine occurrence? Air shows routinely occur all throughout the year all over the country. It seems like preparation is the key.
Yeah, I would agree. I think, working with the local partners in particular on the early end, and finding out who that air boss is and what kind of communication needs to happen with them. The earlier you can do that, the better. That would be my suggestion. But that might not always be the case, depending on the number of local resources you have available to you, and who's being hired at what time to do what things. Again, thankfully here in the Sioux Falls area, we have really good relationships with so many of our local partners that didn't become an issue. But that would be my suggestion.
And we'll have one last comment here from Mike Jamalkowski. Excellent briefing, Peter. I'm a retired USAF weather officer and led the weather detachment at Grand Forks Air Force Base, North Dakota, a couple of years ago. It's great to see so many good tools available now for such support. I'm surprised that Sioux Falls does not appear to have an on-site Air Force weather detachment or operating location supporting the ANG unit. I had an OL at Fargo, North Fargo, North Dakota to support the ANG there. So just another comment on what a great job you've done. And with that, I'm going to pass this back over to Jordan.
Once again, thanks so much for our facilitator and our presenter today for this great presentation. I really appreciated the question and answer session that we had following the presentation as well. So thanks for those of you that contributed to that. The Satellite Book Club will be continuing next week, Thursday, October 12th at our normal time. As has been mentioned, Jordan Rabinowitz from Eastern Region Headquarters is going to talk about the Weather Service Satellite Product Training Guide. So if you're interested in that, please join us again next week. In the meantime, if you have any questions about the configuration of satellite products and AWIPS, as I mentioned, Kishad and Emily, their email addresses are there on the screen, or find us in the TowerS channel on the NWS internal Slack workspace. That's also a great place for if you're just wondering if there's a brief momentary goes outage or SBN outage of your satellite data, might be a good place to check and get some immediate feedback. So we don't staff that around the clock, but we do try to staff it at least during the day and as our staff is available. So with that, we'll wrap it up for today. Once again, thanks to our presenter, our facilitator, and all of you for being with us. Continue to have a great fall, everybody, and woohoo, thank goodness we're going to keep getting paid. Take care, everybody.